In the crisp autumn of 1959, the vibrant Cirque de l'Étrange, a kaleidoscope of light and wonder, vanished without a trace from the quiet logging town of Serenity Creek, Oregon. One night they were the town's dazzling centerpiece, and the next they were gone, leaving behind only an eerie silence on the frosted grass where their big top had stood. It was a disappearance so absolute, it felt more like an illusion than an event, a magic trick with no final bow. 40 years later, a routine land survey, deep within the Cascade foothills, would unearth a ghostly tableau frozen in time, revealing that the circus never fled at all. The discovery would prove that their final act was not one of escape, but of a horrifying, meticulously concealed tragedy. A secret the town itself had conspired to bury alongside the performers, a truth far more sinister than the simple tale of runaway debtors that had been told for generations. Serenity Creek in 1959 was a town carved from timber and tradition, a place defined by the whine of sawmills and the stoic resolve of its people. Life moved at the pace of the seasons, dictated by the logging industry that was both its lifeblood and its master. Strangers were a novelty, and excitement was a rare commodity, measured in the changing colors of the maple trees that lined the single main street of the secluded Oregon community. A place that valued privacy above all else. The arrival of the Cirque de l'Étrange that September was like a sudden, brilliant fever. It descended upon the town's outskirts with a flourish of canvas, color, and the exotic scent of sawdust and caramel. For 2 weeks the circus was a world unto itself, a pocket of impossible dreams set against the stark backdrop of the dense, imposing forests. The townspeople, initially wary, soon found themselves captivated by the spectacle, a welcome distraction from their predictable lives. At the heart of this spectacle was ringmaster Alistair Reed, a man who seemed woven from showmanship and charisma. With a flick of his wrist and a booming voice that commanded attention, he guided the audience through a world of acrobats who defied gravity and clowns whose painted smiles hid a knowing sadness. He was the master of ceremonies, the face of the circus, and the keeper of its many secrets, a figure both enchanting and enigmatic to the locals. His troupe was a family of wanderers, a collection of unique talents bound by loyalty and the shared life of the road. They were skilled performers who lived in a world apart, their brightly painted wagons forming a tight-knit protective circle against the outside world. To the people of Serenity Creek, they were a source of fascination and a little bit of fear, creatures from a different, more colorful reality whose ways were not entirely understood or trusted by the stoic community. Watching over Serenity Creek with an iron will was Sheriff Elias Thorne. He was more than a lawman. He was the town's unassailable patriarch, a figure of absolute authority whose word was law and whose gaze missed nothing. He attended every performance of the circus, not with the joy of a spectator, but with the cold, assessing eyes of a proprietor. His presence was a constant, silent reminder of who held the real power in this isolated corner of the world. The sheriff's scrutiny was particularly sharp when it fell upon his own daughter, a young woman who found herself drawn to the circus's magnetic energy. She was secretly in love with Marco, the lead trapeze artist, a man whose grace in the air was matched only by his charm on the ground. Their romance was a dangerous secret, a forbidden flame burning brightly in the shadows of the big top, far from her father's controlling influence. Their stolen moments were fraught with peril, brief conversations held behind wagons and fleeting glances exchanged across the crowded circus grounds. They both knew the risk. Sheriff Thorne was a possessive father and a man who did not tolerate defiance, especially from those he considered his own. A union between his daughter and a transient performer was not just unthinkable. It was an act of rebellion that he would never permit, a challenge to his absolute control. The final performance was the circus's grandest triumph. The tent was filled to capacity, the air thick with applause, and the collective gasp of an audience mesmerized by the high-wire acts and the daring feats of the performers. Alistair Reed was at his most magnificent, a commanding presence in the center ring, orchestrating a perfect symphony of wonder. For a few hours, the simmering tensions between the town and the troupe seemed to dissolve into pure, unadulterated joy. That night, under a sky devoid of moon or stars, a confrontation took place at the edge of the circus camp. Voices were raised, sharp and angry, cutting through the quiet hum of the crickets. It was a brief but violent clash, an unseen drama that unfolded while the town of Serenity Creek slept soundly, dreaming of the spectacle they had just witnessed. It was the final unrecorded act of the Cirque de l'Étrange, a performance for an audience of none. The following morning, the sun rose on an empty field. The circus was gone. There was no farewell, no parade through town, just an unsettling void where the vibrant camp had been. The trampled grass and the deep ruts of wagon wheels were the only evidence they had ever been there at all. The suddenness of their departure left a palpable sense of unease, a question hanging in the morning mist that no one dared to ask aloud. It was Sheriff Elias Thorne himself who provided the official answer. He filed a brief report, his handwriting firm and decisive. The circus troupe, he explained, had been heavily in debt to local merchants. Led by the con artist Alistair Reed, they had simply packed up in the dead of night and fled, skipping town, to avoid their financial obligations. It was a simple, clean narrative that painted the performers as dishonorable drifters. The town readily accepted this version of events. It was easier to believe in the duplicity of outsiders than to confront a more complicated or disturbing truth. The story of the runaway circus quickly became local lore, a cautionary tale about the perils of trusting strangers. The merchants wrote off their losses, the people went back to their routines, and the mystery of the circus's sudden departure was officially and conveniently closed by the highest authority. Alistair Reed was branded a swindler, his name a byword for betrayal. His family, living states away, received the news with a mixture of shock and shame, forced to carry the weight of his supposed desertion for decades. The official story cemented his legacy as a man who abandoned his troupe, his honor, and his own kin without a second thought, leaving a permanent stain on his family's name. For 40 years, the silence of the forest held the truth. The official story hardened into accepted history, a foundational myth of Serenity Creek's self-reliance and the untrustworthy nature of the world beyond its borders. The disappearance was no longer treated as a mystery, but as a closed case, a simple matter of fraud and flight that required no further investigation or thought. The community moved on, the generation that had witnessed the circus growing old and passing their version of the story down to their children. The empty field on the edge of town was eventually developed, erasing the last physical traces of the Cirque de l'Étrange's brief, dazzling stay. The memory of the circus faded from a vivid event into a hazy, half-forgotten piece of local folklore. Behind the accepted narrative, however, a few lingering questions remained, unspoken but persistent. Why would a circus at the peak of its local success, drawing in record crowds and profits, suddenly flee? Why did they leave behind personal items of value, as some early rumors suggested? These were questions that were quickly dismissed as irrelevant in the face of the sheriff's definitive report. The children of the performers left behind in orphanages or with distant relatives in other states grew up with fragmented memories and the heavy burden of abandonment. They knew nothing of Serenity Creek or the final fateful night. They only knew that their parents were part of a traveling show that had, for all intents and purposes, vanished from the face of the earth, leaving them behind. The real story was preserved not in memory, but in the cold, damp earth of the Cascade foothills. The colorful wagons, the heart of the circus, had not rolled on to the next town. They had been driven deep into the woods, arranged in a perfect funereal circle, and abandoned to the relentless forces of nature, a silent, hidden monument to a terrible secret. The forest grew around them, its thick canopy shielding the scene from the sky, its roots and vines slowly reclaiming the painted wood. The caravans became a part of the landscape, a ghostly fleet sinking into the forest floor, their once vibrant colors fading under layers of moss and time. They held the answers, waiting for a moment of chance to bring them back into the light. The official report, filed away in the county courthouse, gathered dust. It was a masterfully simple piece of deception, attributing the disappearance to greed and cowardice. It protected the town, it protected the powerful, and it ensured that no one would ever go looking for a troupe that was, by all official accounts, simply on the run from the law and their own responsibilities. The ferita aberta, the open wound, was not the town's, but that of Alistair Reed's family. His granddaughter, born years after his disappearance, would grow up haunted by the ghost of a man she never knew, a man defined by a single, shameful act of desertion. It was a family history built upon a foundation of lies, a mystery that festered just beneath the surface of their lives. For 40 years, that official narrative remained unchallenged, a story set in stone by a man everyone trusted. But what no one in Serenity Creek knew, or perhaps what they chose to forget, was that the evidence of the crime wasn't gone. It was merely hidden, patiently waiting for the day the trees would be forced to give up their darkest secret. Who, after all, had benefited most from their silence? The year is 1999. 40 years of seasons have passed over Serenity Creek, burying the memory of the Cirque de l'Étrange under layers of new growth and civic forgetting. Deep in the Cascade foothills, far from any marked trail, the relentless growl of a logging company's feller buncher echoed through the ancient timber. For the crew, it was just another Tuesday, another section of a vast, state-leased tract of old-growth forest to be cleared. The work was routine, methodical, and governed by the unyielding logic of board feet and profit margins, with no thought given to the secrets the earth beneath them might hold. It was a young operator named Ben who felt the first jolt of irregularity. His machine's powerful saw, designed to shear through centuries-old Douglas firs, bit into something unyielding and strangely resonant. It wasn't rock, and it wasn't the dense heartwood of a petrified log. He cut the engine, the sudden silence of the forest rushing in to fill the void. Cursing the delay, he climbed down from his cab to inspect the obstruction, expecting a discarded piece of old mining equipment, a common enough nuisance in these remote woods. What he found would stop his heart for a beat. Pushing aside a thick carpet of moss and a tangle of salal bushes, he uncovered a curved piece of wood, its surface adorned with the ghostly remnants of hand-painted scrollwork in faded crimson and gold. It was a wagon wheel, half swallowed by the forest floor. A sense of profound unease settled over him as his eyes followed the line of decay from the wheel to the larger shape it was attached to. He was not looking at discarded junk. He was looking at a tomb, a wooden vessel, that had been deliberately surrendered to the wilderness decades ago. He called over his foreman, and together they began to clear the surrounding area with a cautious urgency. The discovery grew more staggering with every foot of earth they uncovered. It was not one wagon, but an entire caravan. They were arranged in a perfect defensive circle, just as they would have been at a bustling campsite. Their canvas tops had long since rotted away, leaving skeletal wooden ribs reaching for a sky they hadn't seen in 4 decades. The scene was a ghostly tableau, a fleet of silent ships scuttled in a sea of green utterly and impossibly out of place. The foreman, a man who had worked these woods his entire life, recognized the faded lettering on the lead caravan, Cirque de l'Étrange. The name was a piece of local folklore, a half-remembered story his grandfather used to tell about swindlers who fled in the night. The official story, however, crumbled into dust before his eyes. A circus that had supposedly fled to parts unknown had, in fact, never left the county line. The call to the sheriff's department was made not with the excitement of a discovery, but with the somber gravity of men who knew they had stumbled upon a graveyard. Hundreds of miles away, in a university office cluttered with historical texts and archival maps, Dr. Evelyn Reed answered a phone call that would bifurcate her life into a before and an after. On the other end of the line, a county detective from a town she knew only from whispers and a faded, shameful family history, spoke with careful, professional detachment. He informed her that the remains of her grandfather's circus had been found. For Evelyn, a meticulous historian who had dedicated her career to unearthing erased narratives, the news was a professional bombshell and a deeply personal earthquake. She had spent her entire adult life grappling with the legacy of Alistair Reed, the grandfather she never met. The official story of his desertion had been a source of private shame, a narrative that never quite aligned with the few letters and photographs she possessed of a man who seemed devoted to his troupe. The detective's words were a vindication she had never expected to receive. They were not runaways. They were not debtors. They were victims. She booked the first flight to Oregon, a 40-year-old question burning in her mind not as a mystery, but as an accusation. Upon her arrival in Serenity Creek, Evelyn was escorted to the site. The scene was even more haunting than she had imagined. The logging operation had been halted, and the area was now cordoned off with police tape, an anachronistic splash of yellow against the deep greens and browns of the forest. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, a funereal perfume for a tragedy that had gone unmourned for 2 generations. She saw the wagons arranged in their silent, final formation and felt the weight of 40 years of lies settle upon her shoulders. This was not the camp of people planning a swift departure. Inside one of the smaller wagons, forensic technicians were carefully documenting a small table, still set for a meal that was never finished, petrified remnants of food on the plates. In another, a child's worn rag doll lay on a narrow cot, its button eyes staring up at the skeletal remains of the roof. Costumes, worth a considerable sum even then, still hung on hooks, their once vibrant sequins and silks now muted and moldering. These were the possessions of people who expected to wake up the next morning. The discovery categorically and violently refuted the official narrative Sheriff Elias Thorne had so carefully constructed. A troop on the run would have taken their valuables, their costumes, and their cash boxes. They would not have left behind personal keepsakes and the tools of their trade. They would not have driven their entire operation deep into an impassable forest with no intention of ever driving it out again. This was not the scene of a flight. It was the meticulously concealed evidence of a slaughter, an erasure of life on a scale the small town could not comprehend. Evelyn felt a cold, clarifying rage replace the lifelong ache of her family's shame. Her grandfather was not a con artist who had abandoned his family and his responsibilities. He was a man who had been silenced, his name deliberately tarnished to conceal a monstrous crime. The town of Serenity Creek had not been the victim of a traveling show's deceit. It had been the beneficiary of its disappearance, thriving on a foundation of silence and complicity that had held firm for 4 decades, protecting the guilty and condemning the innocent to a forgotten, unmarked grave. Her presence in town was not universally welcomed. She was met at the edge of the police cordon by the town's current mayor, Richard Thorne. He was the son of the late, revered Sheriff Elias Thorne, a man whose portrait hung in the town hall and whose name was etched onto a commemorative plaque in the town square. Mayor Thorne was polished and exuded an aura of compassionate authority, offering his sincerest condolences for what he called a troubling but ultimately historical curiosity. His words were smooth, but his eyes were as cold and watchful as his father's had reportedly been. he gently tried to steer her away from the more sinister implications of the discovery, suggesting that perhaps her grandfather had simply chosen this remote location as a place to abandon his failing enterprise, a final dramatic act of a desperate man. He spoke of Alistair Reed with a practiced pity, reinforcing the established narrative of an irresponsible showman who had brought his ruin upon himself and his people. It was a masterful performance in public relations, designed to contain the truth before it could truly escape the confines of the forest. For Evelyn, listening to the son of the man who had authored the original lie, the puzzle pieces began to shift into a horrifying new alignment. This was not just an old, forgotten crime. It was an actively protected secret. Mayor Thorne's placating tone and his careful choice of words were not those of a public servant seeking truth, but of a gatekeeper, reinforcing the walls of a long-held conspiracy. He was not just protecting his father's legacy, he was protecting the town itself from the seismic shock of what really happened that night in 1959. The polite but firm wall of resistance she encountered was immediate. Old Town records, she requested, were suddenly misplaced. The few elderly residents she approached, people who would have been young adults in 1959, would offer a tight-lipped "I don't recall," before quickly retreating behind their doors. Serenity Creek had kept its secret for 40 years, and it was clear that the descendants of those who had enforced the silence were not about to let an outsider, especially the granddaughter of the man they had scapegoated, tear it all down. This resistance transformed Evelyn's quest from a personal mission to a full-blown investigation. She was no longer just seeking to clear her grandfather's name. She was seeking justice for an entire troop of people who had been systematically erased from history. The town's quiet hostility was not a deterrent, it was a confirmation. They were hiding something terrible, a truth so dark that they had conspired through generations to bury it as deeply as the circus wagons themselves. She now understood that she was not just fighting a ghost. She was fighting a living, breathing conspiracy. The discovery of the wagons was the midpoint transformation, the moment a sad family legend of abandonment was irrevocably proven to be a cold case of mass murder. The official story was dead, shattered by the undeniable evidence of the silent, rotting caravans. The question was no longer if a crime had been committed, but who had committed it, and how they had managed to enforce 40 years of absolute, unbroken silence from an entire community. The town's stoic facade now seemed less like quiet dignity and more like a collective mask hiding a terrible guilt. Evelyn stood before the lead wagon, her grandfather's wagon, and made a silent vow. She would not leave Serenity Creek until she had uncovered every detail of that final, unrecorded act. She would be the voice for the dozens of performers who had been silenced, the historian who would write their final, true chapter. She would dismantle the comfortable lies the town had told itself, brick by brick, until the foundation of the conspiracy crumbled, and the truth was finally brought into the light, no matter who it implicated or what revered legacies it destroyed in the process. The local authorities assigned a young, ambitious county detective to the case, an outsider named Miller, who was immune to the town's ingrained loyalties and unspoken rules. He saw the scene for what it was, a mass grave disguised as a historical anomaly. He was skeptical of the town's collective amnesia and saw in Evelyn not a grieving relative, but a valuable partner, a living link to the past with a powerful motivation to uncover the truth. Their alliance was forged in the shadow of the dead circus, a partnership against the town's carefully guarded history. Mayor Thorne, observing this new alliance, escalated his efforts to control the narrative. He gave a press conference, framing the discovery as a tragedy, yes, but one rooted in the unfortunate choices made by Alistair Reed. He announced the formation of a town committee to oversee the creation of a memorial, a subtle but brilliant move to seize ownership of the event and guide it toward a conclusion that would preserve the town's and his family's honor. It was a public declaration that the truth would be managed, not revealed. Evelyn recognized the strategy immediately. Mayor Thorne was attempting to turn her grandfather's tomb into a tourist attraction, a sanitized piece of dark history that would absolve the town of any culpability. He was trying to close the book on the investigation before it had even truly begun. This only strengthened her resolve. She knew the key to the entire mystery was not in the town's curated archives or in the evasive memories of its older residents. It had to be somewhere in the wagons themselves, a piece of evidence overlooked. The forensic teams continued their painstaking work, cataloging every rusted buckle and rotted piece of fabric. The sheer volume of personal effects left behind painted a clear and chilling picture of a community ambushed, their lives extinguished in an instant. There were no signs of a struggle within the wagons, no bullet holes or bloodstains. This suggested a terrifying level of control and execution. The performers had been lured or forced from their homes before being killed, their possessions left untouched to create a scene of eerie, undisturbed domesticity. This lack of overt violence at the site was, in itself, a crucial clue. It pointed not to a chaotic massacre, but to an organized, almost military-style operation. It would have required planning, manpower, and a level of authority capable of commanding absolute obedience and secrecy. It was the kind of operation that could only have been orchestrated by someone who controlled the law itself, someone who could guarantee that no one would ever come looking for the victims, because he had the power to declare them criminals on the run. The focus of the investigation began to narrow, shifting from the victims to the man who had written their official epitaph, Sheriff Elias Thorne. He had the motive, his daughter's forbidden romance with a circus performer. He had the means, a loyal force of deputies and the unquestioned authority of a patriarch. And he had the opportunity, a remote location, and a town conditioned to accept his word as gospel. The ghost of the old sheriff now loomed over the investigation, his iron-fisted rule reaching out from the grave. Evelyn felt she was on the precipice of a monumental breakthrough. The discovery had reawakened a sleeping monster, and she could feel the town tensing around her, the pressure of the 40-year-old secret threatening to crack its serene facade. She knew that somewhere in the wreckage of her grandfather's life, in a forgotten corner of his wagon or a hidden compartment of a travel trunk, a final message was waiting to be found. A message that would not only clear his name, but would also act as his final performance, the great reveal. The initial shock of the discovery began to subside, replaced by the grim and methodical process of a full-scale homicide investigation. The case of the vanished Cirque de l'Étrange was officially reopened, now classified as a multiple-victim murder. The old dusty file from 1959 was retrieved from the county archives, its single page, authored by Sheriff Thorne, now reading less like a police report and more like the first chapter of a meticulously crafted lie, a cover story for an almost perfect crime. The media descended on Serenity Creek, transforming the quiet town into the center of a national news story. The tale of the ghost circus captured the public's imagination, a gothic mystery unearthed in the misty forests of the Pacific Northwest. For the world, it was a fascinating story. For Evelyn, it was a race against time. She had to find the definitive proof that would incriminate the true killers before the weight of the town's legacy and the political maneuvering of Mayor Thorne could bury it all over again. She requested sole access to her grandfather's ringmaster wagon, arguing that, as his next of kin and as a historian, she might recognize the significance of items that forensic teams would overlook. Detective Miller, trusting his gut, agreed, granting her a limited window to conduct her own search of the caravan's interior. He sensed, as she did, that the answer lay within those decaying walls, a secret kept by the ringmaster himself, waiting for the right person to finally find it. Evelyn stepped into the wagon alone, the air thick with the ghosts of the past. It was here, in this small, confined space, that the final act of her family's story would be written. She was no longer just a historian studying a cold case. She was a participant, the final player in a drama set in motion 4 decades earlier. The truth was here. She could feel it. She just had to find where a master of illusion would hide his most important secret. The silent Caravans had finally yielded their primary secret, that the circus never left. But this discovery was merely the first piece of a macabre puzzle that had been carefully constructed to mislead and conceal. Unlocking the truth would require more than just finding the bodies. It would require dismantling a legacy built on power, fear, and a town's unholy pact of silence. The investigation began not with a bang, but with the quiet rustle of brittle, yellowed paper. Detective Miller, an island of procedural calm in a town roiling with buried history, secured the original 1959 case file from the county archives. It was shockingly, almost insultingly, thin. The entire disappearance of over 36 people was summarized in a single-page report authored and signed by Sheriff Elias Thorne. His declarative script left no room for ambiguity, painting Alistair Reed as a common swindler who had simply fled his debts. There were no witness statements, no inventory of abandoned property, and no follow-up inquiries. It was not an investigation. It was a decree, a story written into fact by the sheer force of one man's authority. Evelyn Reed examined a high-resolution scan of the document, her historian's eye catching details a layman might miss. The ink was uniform, the pressure of the pen unwavering. There was no hesitation, no correction. It was the work of a man supremely confident in his narrative, or one who knew no one would ever dare to question it. This document was the cornerstone of the town's 40-year lie. To bring it down, they would need more than just the discovery of the wagons. They would need to systematically dismantle every word Thorne had written, exposing the foundation of his story as a calculated deception designed to conceal an atrocity. Their first step was to seek out the living memory of Serenity Creek. Miller and Evelyn compiled a list of residents who were young adults in 1959, the silent witnesses to the circus's final days. They started with a retired sawmill foreman living in a small house at the edge of town. When they mentioned the Cirque de l'Étrange, the old man's affable demeanor vanished, replaced by guarded, almost fearful stillness. He claimed his memory was failing him, that those days were a blur. But his eyes, sharp and clear, darted towards the framed photograph of the late Sheriff Thorne on his mantelpiece, a silent testament to a loyalty or fear that had not faded with time. This pattern of collective amnesia repeated itself across the town. An elderly woman who had run the local diner spoke of the circus with a brief flash of youthful excitement before her words grew clipped and evasive. A former deputy, now frail and in a nursing home, suffered a sudden bout of confusion when Miller asked about the night the circus left. It was a conspiracy of silence, not active and malicious, but passive and deeply ingrained, a communal reflex born from decades of unspoken understanding. The name Thorne still held power here, a key that locked mouths and shuttered memories against the intrusion of outsiders asking dangerous questions. Frustrated by the wall of silence, Miller shifted the investigation's focus to the hard evidence, the wagons themselves. The forensic team had established a mobile command center at the Discovery site, a hub of modern science in the ancient forest. Their initial findings were profoundly unsettling. While the elements had taken their toll, the interiors of the caravans were in a state of eerie preservation. But what was most telling was not what they found, but what they did not. There were no fingerprints on any smooth surfaces, not on lanterns, not on cutlery, not even on the personal lockboxes. The wagons had been systematically and professionally wiped clean. This single forensic fact was a bombshell. A troupe of performers fleeing in the dead of night would not have stopped to meticulously erase their own presence. They would have been hasty, careless, leaving behind the chaotic evidence of a rapid departure. The absence of prints was not an oversight. It was a signature. It spoke of a third party, an organized group that had entered the camp after the performers were gone or had been removed, and scoured the scene of all identifying markers. Who in Serenity Creek in 1959 would have possessed the knowledge and authority to conduct such a thorough forensic cleanup? The question hung in the air, its answer pointing like a compass needle in one direction. The analysis of soil samples from around the wagons yielded another critical clue. Geologists found traces of quicklime, a caustic substance often used in the past to accelerate decomposition and suppress the odor of decay. While not definitive proof of a mass grave at that specific site, its presence was highly anomalous and deeply suspicious. Someone had not only wanted the circus to disappear, they had wanted the very evidence of their existence to be chemically erased from the earth. This was not the work of a panicked debtor. It was the cold, calculated methodology of a killer trying to commit the perfect crime. Evelyn, meanwhile, immersed herself in the personal artifacts recovered from the site, items the forensic teams had cataloged but could not interpret. She studied the faded photographs of smiling performers, putting names and faces to the missing. She read the fragments of letters, piecing together the social fabric of the troupe. They were not the transient grifters of Thorne's report. They were a family bound by the road and their shared craft. A picture emerged of a close-knit community, proud and self-sufficient, the very opposite of the dishonorable fugitives they were made out to be. Her research kept circling back to the rumored romance between Sheriff Thorne's daughter, Clara, and the trapeze artist, Marco. In a small water-damaged trunk belonging to one of the clowns, Evelyn found a playbill from the final performance. On the back, a small, almost invisible note was scribbled in pencil. Clara and Marco, midnight, the Old Oak. It was a tiny, insignificant detail to anyone else, but for Evelyn, it was a piece of the timeline. It suggested a planned meeting, a rendezvous that likely coincided with the very window of time in which the entire circus vanished from the face of the earth. This discovery gave their investigation a focal point, motive. Elias Thorne was known to be a fiercely possessive father, a patriarch who ruled his family with the same iron fist he ruled the town. The idea of his daughter running away with a transient circus performer would have been more than a family disgrace. It would have been a direct challenge to his absolute authority. Was it possible that the disappearance of an entire circus was collateral damage in a violent personal conflict? Could one man's rage have been the spark that ignited a massacre? The theory was monstrous, but it fit the evidence. A confrontation at the Old Oak Tree, a violent outburst, a death, and then the terrible logical necessity of silencing the only witnesses, the entire Cirque de l'Étrange. It would have required planning, manpower, and the unwavering loyalty of his deputies. It would have required the power to control the narrative, to declare the victims as perpetrators, and to enforce a town-wide silence that would last for generations. Only one man in Serenity Creek had that kind of power. Mayor Richard Thorne, feeling the pressure of the investigation tightening around his family's legacy, began a subtle but effective campaign of obstruction. He gave interviews to the press, expressing his deep sympathy for Evelyn while simultaneously casting doubt on her emotionally driven theories. He spoke of his father as a pillar of the community, a man who brought order to a wild frontier town, subtly painting any attack on his character as an attack on the town itself. He was not defending a man. He was defending a myth, the foundational myth of Serenity Creek. He questioned the allocation of county resources to what he publicly termed a 40-year-old tragedy with no living suspects, suggesting the investigation was a waste of taxpayer money. His statements were carefully crafted to sound reasonable, compassionate, and fiscally responsible. But to Evelyn and Miller, his intentions were crystal clear. He was using his political influence to starve their investigation, to bleed it dry until it became another cold case, another dusty file in the county archives. The son was protecting the father's sins with the same calculated precision. The conflict between the mayor's public statements and the emerging evidence became stark. While Mayor Thorne spoke of a simple case of runaway debtors, the forensic reports on Miller's desk screamed of a meticulously organized execution and cover-up. While Thorne praised his father's commitment to justice, Evelyn was uncovering a story of obsessive control and violent rage. The cracks in the Thorne family facade were no longer just visible. They were becoming gaping chasms, revealing the darkness that had been hidden behind the veneer of civic duty for decades. Detective Miller, now convinced he was investigating a mass murder orchestrated by a former sheriff, decided to escalate his tactics. He formally re-interviewed the retired deputy, this time bringing a forensic psychologist. Faced with the specific technical evidence of the wiped fingerprints and the quicklime, the old man's wall of confusion finally crumbled. He didn't confess, but his denial was weak, his hands trembling, as he insisted Sheriff Thorne was a good man who did what was necessary to protect the town from unwanted elements. The non-denial was as damning as a confession. The phrase, "did what was necessary," echoed in Evelyn's mind. It was the language of justification, the rhetoric of a man convinced of his own righteousness. Elias Thorne hadn't seen his actions as murder. He had seen them as a form of brutal, necessary surgery, cutting a perceived cancer out of his town and his family. This psychological insight was crucial. It meant Thorne might have been arrogant, so confident in his power that he might have overlooked something, leaving behind a piece of evidence he believed no one would ever be powerful enough to find or intelligent enough to understand. This realization led Evelyn back to the one place that felt like the heart of the mystery: her grandfather's ringmaster wagon. It had been processed by the forensics team, but she argued that they were looking for evidence of a crime, not evidence of a story. She, as Alistair Reed's granddaughter, and as a historian, might recognize the significance of an object, a hidden compartment, or a coded message that would be meaningless to law enforcement. She needed to search the wagon not as a crime scene, but as the final, desperate archive of a man who knew he was about to be silenced. After a tense negotiation, Miller agreed, granting her supervised access. Stepping into the cramped, decaying space was like stepping into a tomb. The air was heavy with the scent of mold and memory. She ran her hands over the damp wood of the small, built-in desk, trying to channel her grandfather's mindset. Where would a man of secrets, a master of illusion and misdirection, hide his ultimate truth? He wouldn't bury it. He would conceal it in plain sight, using the very tools of his trade. Her eyes scanned the interior, past the rotted remains of his flamboyant costumes and the tarnished brass of his ringmaster's megaphone. She focused on the large, heavy travel trunk at the foot of his cot, a piece that was common for the era. The forensics team had opened it and cataloged its contents. A few changes of clothes, some books, and personal effects. They had found nothing of evidentiary value. But Evelyn noticed the trunk's construction was unusual. The interior depth seemed shallower than its exterior dimensions would suggest. It was a classic magician's trick. With a crowbar provided by a waiting deputy, she carefully pried at the trunk's interior floorboards. The rotten wood splintered and gave way, revealing not a hidden compartment, but a false bottom. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. It was her grandfather's personal logbook, a place for him to record financial details, performance notes, and private thoughts. Her hands trembled as she opened it, the dry pages crackling in the profound silence of the forest. The first several pages contained routine entries, ticket sales, notes on the performers, sketches for new acts. But as she turned to the final entries from September 1959, the handwriting changed. The neat, practiced cursive became a frantic, jagged scrawl, the words pressed so hard into the page that they were nearly torn through. It was not a record of finances, it was a witness statement, written by a man who knew he was documenting his own murder. The truth had been here all along, waiting for 40 years. The ink on the page was a ghost, a voice from a silent massacre. Alistair Reed, in his final hours, had done the one thing his killer had not anticipated. He had not tried to fight, and he had not tried to run. He had done what he had always done. He had recorded the show. He had written down the details of the final terrible act of the Cirque de l'Étrange, ensuring that the truth, however long it took, would one day have its grand reveal. The ledger was not just evidence. It was a script, penned by the victim himself. Holding the book, Evelyn felt the full weight of her grandfather's final moments. He had been a showman, but in the end he had become a historian, his final act a desperate attempt to preserve the truth against the crushing force of a tyrant's lie. The ledger was the proof trophy, the irrefutable object that could not be explained away by the mayor or denied by the silent townspeople. It was the key that would unlock the mass grave and expose the celebrated Thorne legacy for the murderous fraud it truly was. Detective Miller took the ledger as if it were a sacred relic, placing it in a secure evidence bag. The scientific, methodical investigation had just collided with the deeply personal. Modern forensics had confirmed the cover-up, but it was the old-fashioned, analog testimony of a dead man that would ultimately identify the killer. The careful deconstruction of the official narrative was now complete. All that was left was to confront the town with the contents of the book and the monster it had protected for so long. The alliance between the historian and the detective had succeeded where 40 years of silence had failed. They had followed the cold trail from a forgotten file to a whispered rumor, from a lack of fingerprints to a hidden book. Each step had been a methodical refutation of the official story, a layer of lies peeled back to reveal the horrifying truth beneath. The investigation had exposed not just a crime, but a conspiracy woven into the very identity of Serenity Creek. Evelyn looked from the ledger to the ring of silent wagons around her. Her quest to clear her grandfather's name was over. He was not a swindler who had abandoned his family. He was a hero who had left behind the weapon that would one day deliver his justice. The shame her family had carried for 2 generations was finally lifted, replaced by a profound and sorrowful pride. Her grandfather had orchestrated one last magnificent performance, and she was here to make sure everyone saw the finale. The meticulous reconstruction of the timeline was now complete. They had the motive in the forbidden romance, the means in the sheriff's absolute power, and the methodology in the forensic evidence of a cover-up. And now, thanks to Alistair Reed, they had the confession. The questions that had driven the investigation, who did this and why, had been answered in the frantic scrawl of a dying man. If the ledger was as damning as it appeared, it would not only solve the case, but also detonate the foundational myth of Serenity Creek. It would prove that its most revered figure was a mass murderer and that his son, the current mayor, was an active accessory to the cover-up. The new investigation had unearthed a truth far more terrible than a simple case of murder. It had uncovered a legacy of evil that had been masquerading as civic pride for nearly half a century. The discovery of the wagons had reopened the case, but the discovery of the ledger had armed the prosecution with an irrefutable weapon. The systematic investigation had exposed the cracks in the town's facade, and now, with this final piece of evidence, the entire rotten structure was about to come crashing down. What would happen when a town built on a lie was finally forced to confront the unvarnished, brutal truth of its own history? The answer would come not from a courtroom, but from the very soul of the community itself. The ledger lay open on the sterile metal of the forensics table, its fragile pages a testament to a truth that had refused to decay. In the dim light of the evidence tent, Detective Miller and Evelyn Reed read the final frantic entries from Alistair Reed. The elegant showman's script had devolved into a desperate, jagged scrawl, documenting a horror that unfolded in real time. He wrote of the confrontation at the Old Oak, of Sheriff Thorne's uncontrollable rage upon discovering his daughter's plan to elope with Marco, the trapeze artist. He described the sickening thud of a body hitting the ground, an argument that had escalated to accidental, irreversible violence in the blink of an eye. The motive was no longer a theory. It was a fact, written in the victim's own ink. The final entry was the most chilling, a postscript to a massacre. "Thorne saw me. He knows I know," Alistair had written, the words pressing deep into the paper. "He has returned with his deputies. They are surrounding the camp. He says no one is leaving." This was not just a diary. It was a final, desperate broadcast from a sinking ship, a witness statement penned in the face of certain death. It was the irrefutable evidence that transformed the case from a tragic mystery into a documented, state-sanctioned execution. The disappearance of the Cirque de l'Étrange was not a cover-up for one murder, but the commission of 36 more to ensure that single secret remained buried forever. With the ledger secured as primary evidence, the legal machinery moved with a speed that felt jarring after 40 years of inertia. Detective Miller, his face a mask of grim determination, immediately petitioned a county judge for a warrant. The target was not a building or a person, but a piece of land imbued with civic sanctity, the old Thorne property, which had been donated to the town by Richard Thorne and converted into a memorial park. The warrant was granted based on the ledger's explicit testimony, allowing for the use of ground-penetrating radar to search for the one thing the forest had not yet surrendered, the bodies of the victims. The news of the ledger and the impending search of the Thorne property ripped through Serenity Creek like a shock wave. Decades of carefully constructed myth began to crumble. Mayor Richard Thorne held an emergency press conference, his polished composure finally showing cracks. He denounced the ledger as a forgery, a desperate fantasy concocted by a swindler to frame a good man. He portrayed his father as the victim of a posthumous character assassination, and Evelyn as a woman blinded by grief and a thirst for revenge. But his words, once so authoritative, now sounded hollow and defensive, the desperate bluster of a man watching his kingdom's foundations turn to dust before his very eyes. The investigative team arrived at Thorne Memorial Park the following dawn. The bronze statue of Sheriff Elias Thorne, arm outstretched in a pose of paternal protection, seemed to cast a long, dark shadow over the proceedings. As the GPR technicians began their methodical grid search across the manicured lawns, a crowd of townspeople gathered, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity, dread, and fierce denial. They were watching the exhumation of not just a potential crime scene, but of their own collective identity. The park, a symbol of the town's proud heritage, was about to become its most profound source of shame, a monument to a lie. The radar produced an anomaly almost immediately, a large rectangular disturbance in the earth, located in a secluded grove of birch trees behind the main picnic area. It was far too large and geometrically regular to be a natural formation. The operator marked the coordinates with grim finality. He had found the burial site. The hushed silence of the crowd was broken only by the sharp, rhythmic scrape of shovels against soil as the forensic excavation began. Every scoop of earth felt like a page being turned, bringing them closer to the story's horrifying final chapter, a conclusion that had been violently suppressed for 2 generations. The first confirmation came within an hour. A digger's shovel struck something that was not rock or root. It was the rotted wood of a simple pine coffin, and beside it the tarnished silver of a sequin from a performer's costume, still catching the weak morning light. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers as the truth became tangible, undeniable. The stories were true. The circus had not fled. They had been brought here to this placid park and put into the ground by the very man the town had revered as its protector. The myth of Serenity Creek died in that moment in a 6-foot-deep trench of cold, dark earth. As the day wore on, the full, horrific scale of the massacre was revealed. The remains of 37 men, women, and children were unearthed from the mass grave. The entire Cirque de l'Étrange was accounted for, their final resting place the unhallowed ground of their murderer's own property. The forensic evidence was overwhelming, corroborating every detail in Alistair Reed's ledger. The town's revered patriarch was not a hero. He was a monster who had wiped out an entire community to protect his own pride and conceal his own violent crime. The silence he had commanded for 40 years was finally, irrevocably broken by the voices of the dead. Armed with the ledger and the forensic confirmation from the mass grave, Detective Miller and Evelyn Reed drove to the town hall. There was no need for an arrest warrant. Miller knew the final act of this drama required a confrontation. They found Mayor Richard Thorne in his office, the walls adorned with photographs and commendations celebrating his father's long career. He sat behind the imposing oak desk, a man cornered by history, the last guardian of a disgraced legacy. He looked up as they entered, his face pale, but his eyes defiant, preparing for one final performance of denial. Miller placed the ledger on the polished surface of the desk, its weathered leather a stark contrast to the room's stately decor. He then laid out a series of forensic photographs from the excavation, each one a silent, damning accusation. "We found them, Mayor," Miller said, his voice devoid of triumph, heavy with the weight of the discovery. "We found them all, on your family's land, exactly where Alistair Reed said they would be. It's over." The evidence was absolute, a wall of truth against which no further lies could stand. The time for political maneuvering and public relations had ended. Richard Thorne stared at the photographs, his carefully maintained facade finally shattering. The defiance in his eyes was replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion, the weariness of a man who had spent his entire life upholding a terrible lie. He didn't confess to the crime itself, but to the conspiracy of silence that followed. He admitted that his father had told him the sanitized truth on his deathbed, framing the massacre as a necessary action to remove a corrupting influence from the town after the tragic death of the trapeze artist. Richard's sin was not murder, but the active, lifelong protection of a murderer's legacy. He explained his complicity was born from a twisted sense of civic duty and filial loyalty. He believed he was protecting Serenity Creek from a truth it could not handle, preserving the order and stability his father had built, even if it was founded on a bedrock of blood and lies. His obstruction of the investigation, his public denials, his attempts to discredit Evelyn, all were calculated acts to maintain that fragile peace. In his mind, he was not an accessory to a crime. He was the steward of his father's dark secret, a burden he had chosen to carry for the perceived good of the community. His confession, delivered in a low, defeated monotone, was a portrait of a man crushed by the weight of inherited guilt. He had sacrificed his own morality to deify a monster, perpetuating a cycle of deceit that had poisoned the town for decades. As Detective Miller read him his rights and placed him under arrest for obstruction of justice and accessory after the fact, the moment was not triumphant, but profoundly tragic. The handcuffs clicking around his wrists were the final quiet sound of a dynasty's fall, the end of the Thorne family's long, tyrannical reign over the soul of Serenity Creek. The arrest of Mayor Thorne was the town's final, painful catharsis. The truth, in all its brutal detail, was now public knowledge, laid bare in newspaper headlines and television reports across the country. The name of Elias Thorne was stripped from buildings and street signs, his statue in the park quietly removed in the dead of night, leaving an empty pedestal that seemed to scream of the town's collective guilt and misplaced faith. The community was forced into a painful period of self-reflection, grappling with the knowledge that their peaceful history was a carefully curated fiction. A memorial service was held for the lost souls of the Cirque de l'Étrange. It took place not in a church, but in the open field, where the big top had once stood, the very spot where their laughter and music had last filled the air. Evelyn Reed, her voice steady and clear, stood before the entire town and read the names of every victim, from the high-wire walkers to the clowns, from the animal trainers to the children. She gave them back their identities, transforming them from a forgotten troupe of runaways into a community of artists who had been senselessly and cruelly extinguished. Evelyn's personal journey had reached its bittersweet conclusion. Standing at the newly placed headstone for her grandfather, Alistair Reed, she felt the 40-year-old weight of her family's shame finally lift. He was not a deserter. He was a witness, a man who had used his final moments not to beg for his life, but to ensure the truth would one day be told. She had not only cleared his name, but had also fulfilled his final silent request, to bring down the curtain on the man who had wronged him, and to give his lost family a final dignified bow. The legal proceedings against Richard Thorne were swift. He pled guilty, accepting his role in the long-running cover-up, and was sentenced to prison. His conviction served as a public and legal condemnation of the Thorne legacy, officially closing the book on the case of the vanished circus. Justice, though delayed by 4 decades, had finally been served, not just for the victims, but for the generations of their families who had lived with the uncertainty and the stigma of their disappearance. The open wound in their shared history could now, at last, begin to heal. The story of Clara Thorne, the young woman at the center of the tragedy, was pieced together from old town records. After the massacre, her father had sent her away to a strict boarding school on the East Coast. She never returned to Serenity Creek, eventually marrying and living a quiet, isolated life, forever haunted by the love she had lost and the terrible secret she was forced to carry. She had died only a few years before the discovery of the wagons, taking her story and her grief with her to the grave. Detective Miller, the outsider who had dared to pull at the threads of the town's comfortable narrative, quietly packed up his office. He had solved the county's oldest and darkest cold case, but he felt no sense of celebration. He had seen firsthand how a community could conspire, through fear and willful ignorance, to protect a monstrous lie. His work was done, but he knew the scars on Serenity Creek would remain for generations, a permanent reminder of the high cost of silence and the corrosive power of a single, unchecked man. In the aftermath, the town of Serenity Creek became a quieter, more somber place. The tourists who now came were not drawn by its picturesque charm, but by its dark history, visiting the new memorial that listed the names of the circus performers. The community, stripped of its founding myth, was forced to build a new identity, one based not on a fabricated legacy of strength, but on the humbling and painful acknowledgement of its own past failures. The process was slow and difficult, but it was honest, a first step toward genuine healing and redemption. Evelyn eventually left Serenity Creek, her mission complete. She had arrived as a historian seeking answers and left as the final chronicler of a lost community. She carried with her not just the vindication of her family's name, but a profound understanding of the fragility of truth and the enduring power of memory. She had proven that no story is ever truly erased, that no voice can be silenced forever, and that even after decades of darkness, the facts have a way of fighting their way back into the light. The children of the performers, now adults themselves, were finally given the truth about their parents' fate. For them, the resolution brought a painful closure, replacing the lifelong ache of abandonment with the sharp grief of a murder long past. They learned that their parents had not left them by choice, but were stolen from them by an act of unimaginable cruelty. They could finally mourn their loss properly, their fragmented memories now grounded in the tragic but definitive reality of what had happened in that remote Oregon forest so many years ago. The tale of the Cirque de l'Étrange became a modern legend, a cautionary tale about the darkness that can hide beneath a placid surface and the danger of unchecked power. It was a story of a forbidden love that sparked a massacre, of a town's silent complicity, and of a single determined woman who refused to let the dead remain forgotten. The circus wagons, now housed in a local museum, stood as silent, ghostly monuments to the 37 lives that had been so brutally cut short, their vibrant colors forever faded, but their story now permanently etched into history. The final resolution was not one of happiness, but of profound and necessary truth. The emotional closure for Evelyn and the other descendants was not found in vengeance, but in justice and remembrance. The conviction of Richard Thorne was merely a legal formality. The true victory was the restoration of history, the act of giving names back to the nameless and voices back to the silenced. The horrifying truth had been revealed, and in its revelation, a small, long overdue measure of peace was finally granted to the lost souls of the circus. The old logging roads that wound through the Cascade foothills remained, but they now carried a different weight. They were no longer just paths for industry, but trails leading back to a scene of profound tragedy and, ultimately, profound justice. The forest had kept its secret for 40 years, guarding the evidence of a terrible crime with a patient, silent resolve. It had held the story until the world was ready to listen, proving that some truths are not buried, but merely planted, waiting for the right season to finally break through the soil. The legacy of the Cirque de l'Étrange was no longer defined by its mysterious disappearance, but by the relentless pursuit of the truth that brought its story to light. The final act was not one of tragedy, but of resilience. It demonstrated that history, no matter how deeply it is buried or how fiercely it is protected by lies, possesses a persistent gravitational pull. The echoes of the past can fade, but they never truly vanish. They wait patiently in the silent places of the world for someone to finally listen,